Welcome back to GBGuns, and now that it is nearly December 2020, the article that I wrote on this giant AK, also known as the PSL, is out, so I wanted to give you a look at the gun we used for that article. Coming up next on GBGuns. So, like probably some of you, I got started shooting on cheap Mosin Nagants and a really cheap 7.62 54R. Those of you not familiar with that cartridge, it's been around since about 1891. Big, beefy guy. Bullet weight tends to be 150 to 200 or so. Think of it like 308 that's a little angrier. It's 3 millimeters longer than 308. And the 5.4 is the length of the casing, 54 millimeters. R because it's rimmed, versus say 7.62 3.9, the AK round that you're likely familiar with. Love this round. It used to be, well, available for about the per shot price that 22 is now in late November of 2020 or early December, depending on when this video publishes. So I used to shoot it all the time. Buy these spam cans, sealed cans of Soviet surplus ammo, put them in a cheap Mosin Nagant, go up to the woods and blast away. And I loved the round, loved what it could do, always wanted something in semi-auto. Not a whole lot of options in that caliber. The PSL is one of them. There's of course the Dragunov, which a lot of people think at first this looks Dragunov-esque, with this cool thumbhole stock and long 24.5-inch barrel, plus about 3 inches of muzzle brake on there. Big long gun. The Dragunov is actually a different system. This PSL is essentially an upscaled AK. Something that a lot of people don't understand about Soviet doctrine that used to be part of my profession in the intelligence community is that snipers, as we know them in the US, weren't so much a part of doctrine as were what we're now introducing as designated marksmen. The infantryman with his AK round wasn't meant to engage outside of about 300 meters, running this thing, and the bigger rounds like this were meant for harassing fire of 500 to 800 meters. Not necessarily in the same capacity as that we snipe, more of targets of opportunity, harassing fire, which is stuff that slows or halts troop movement or causes them to change direction, and of course being able to deliver a little more ooey. This gun is not how it ships. It ships with a Russian PSO scope that are very cool. They have an excellent ranging reticle in the corner of them that are great for aiming at man-sized targets. It tells you line up about a 5'10" person or target in a slope to the left side of the reticle. That will tell you how many 100 meters away the target is. Then you use your bullet drop in the reticle to hit. And that's awesome. However, did not work so well for wanting to shoot tight groups to see what kind of accuracy we could get out of this super long barrel. So we opted for an RS Regulate mount. They have a really cool modular system. A little confusing at first while you're shopping through because you choose first your base, and the PSL does have a different scope mount than an AK. Then you choose your top piece. You can see the screws there. This goes on top, depending on what you want to throw on top of the gun. We wanted some big glass, so we've got a 4-16 by 50 on here that made shooting 100 yards with aged eyes a whole lot easier to do. Unique features about this thing, to start off, something that I didn't know till I had my hands on one, is there's actually a spring in the butt plate. It can be tightened or loosened, but that works to mitigate recoil. Then of course you have the long stroke piston. You can see quite how long that piston is. I'll pull it out in a second. Plenty of weight and this brake at the end. And so unlike the Mosins, which tend to beat you in the shoulder this is actually really pleasant to shoot. Everything else is very AK. The other unique bit, of course, is that it's a double stack. If you've ever had to load 22 ammo, you know that rimmed cartridges are not fun to load, because if you get one rim, if the rim below is in front of the rim up top, then it won't chamber, because as the bolt tries to push that top round forward, it's going to snag on the bottom one. So what the PSL has done here, you see this wide spot in the magazine right there. That's where the rim starts. Bring it back, and they've idiot-proofed double stacking rimmed cartridges. Pretty neat. Set that to the side. Another nice thing about this magazine design, it rocks and locks just like an AK, is you get last round bolt hold open, which is pretty neat. And it stays after you remove the magazine. There's an extra mechanism in there. There was plenty of extra space in these receivers to make it all happen. So that's kind of a cool thing. It shoots much more like a modern gun than the AK. The development of the PSL came about because during a political spat between Romania and the Soviet Union, Romania was cut off from any Soviet weapon technology or designs and had to develop their own. And so Kujir, cute little town that T and I got to visit last year, their factory got to work on sort of cloning the Dragunov, but rather than change up the system and everything, they just upsized everything. In the magazine article, I've got plenty of photos showing you comparisons, but as I pull this apart, you'll see that everything is basically a giant AK. To field strip, after checking that it's clear, of course, we're going to push in on this spring and remove our top plate. It is still removable as regulate mount, which is something I really like about that. Pull out our buffer spring. Everything is stronger and larger than an AK. That's being only slightly longer. And then our bolt comes out, bring it to the end, find its spot for it to come up when it wants to. Come on. Not a whole lot of room with the mount on there. Right, with our optics mount out of the way, we can now pull this thing out. And you can see it's just like an AK. Piston is a whole lot longer. And of course, our bolt is larger, longer, and has a much larger face. But other than that, everything else is just like an AK. Looking inside, AK style trigger. You can see our bolt catch mechanism is that little guy right there. And then one other thing that they did was went to the bulged trunnion. You see these ribs here on the sides. The trunnion, which sits here, the barrel seats into, and then that is riveted into the stamped receiver, has extensions that run out through here. That strengthens the whole area. Also helps provide some rigidity, which increases accuracy a bit. And as you'll see in the magazine article, we were able to get some decent accuracy out of this thing. I was surprised. I always thought 7.6254 was really not that much of an accuracy round. It wasn't intended for. That cartridge was developed in the days of trench warfare to counter trench warfare. A time when volley fire was still a big deal, and suppressive fire, even with a bolt action, meaning dozens, if not hundreds of troops firing a volley to help keep troops from moving on the enemy side, was a bigger priority than precision accuracy. Plus engineering at the time wasn't exactly where it is for modern cartridges. But this rifle was able to perform pretty well. Lifting this up, which requires some wrenching to pop off your gas tube, everything is just like an AK. Did have a little bit of boil come through here on the handguard during testing, and that's because this barrel got hot, just like how Mosins get hot. 7.6254 is a lot of round, and so the barrel got pretty hot. But it's a neat piece that is one of the very few options you have out there, if not only current production option, to get 7.6254 in a semi-auto platform. And the shooting characteristics, as I mentioned, are different, very different. So those of you who know the Mosins and have come to love or hate the recoil that they have, it's not the same with this guy. It's actually pretty darn soft to shoot, and we really enjoy shooting it. If you'd like to see us do a shooting impressions video on this gun, let me know in the comments below. We don't have all of the ammo that we used for the article anymore, and it's pretty hard to get our hands on, but we do have some of the more basic stuff still available. Magazines for this, I've heard some bad things about. This is what happens when you try to do things in front of a camera. There we go. I had heard bad things about the magazines. That must have been the older imports, the 2 magazines that came with this gun. We've had 0 issues with. They are not inexpensive, but they do hold 10 rounds, which is kind of cool. And like I said, with as hot as this thing gets, you're not going to want to be doing mag dumps out of these. This is for your slow controlled fire. Trigger, by the way, is much like an AK. I'll do it left-handed so you can see. Bring the camera in some. It creeps. You can feel tension build, and it breaks. And a nice, solid, positive reset that brings you just before that wall again. And this is not a special whoop-de-doo trigger. It's just what came in the gun as produced right out of the factory. I've always liked factory AK triggers. Never had an issue with them, aside from some Zastavas having a little bit of slap in them. The rest of them, I haven't experienced that, either because of 922R compliance changes and aftermarket triggers being dropped in. This does not appear to be a Tapco or Century trigger, and I'm wondering if, with the reduced capacity on them, if they're able to bring these in complete as a sporting rifle, because there's not much very assaulty about this thing other than it looking scary to people who don't know about guns. But 7.6254R is a fun round, still very available. It is the longest continuous serving military round in history, which means it's been in production since 1891. There's a lot of it out there, and even some brass stuff. You do want to be careful when shooting brass in AK platforms, as the extraction force was engineered around steel cases. So with brass cases like this, you may run the risk of a torn shell. That's where it leaves some of the brass inside the chamber, pulls out just a stubby, and then tries to shove the next round in to that sleeve of brass still in your chamber. Not a fun thing to experience. Oddly, I've only experienced it once, and that was on an AR, but it is a bit of advice for AK platforms that I've always tried to heed and want to pass on to others to warn about. I'm sure how clean your chamber is, how hot the gun is, all of that becomes a factor as well. But this is a smooth shooter, loads of fun, draws lots of attention at the range, and just a cool piece of the collapse of Soviet strength, if you will. By forcing the Romanians to develop this gun on their own, they also strengthened Romania, and I think that's pretty neat. So that's the PSL. Check out your newsstand for the December issue of Tactical Life magazine. That's where my full review in this is. All of that was done about a year ago. So, like I said, I don't have the same ammo and things available now if you still wanted to see that. But if you guys are curious, let us know in the comments below, and we'd love an excuse to take this out to the range again. Thanks for watching.